My name is Alfred Williams, and I am the founder of Biblical Africa Research Recovery, or the BAR. The goal of the BAR is to place Africa at the center of biblical studies. Now, this is a huge task because the way we have structured Christianity for the last 2,000 years is the result of some very specific historical circumstances. When the Christian church first began, Rome was in power. And so Rome, and more specifically Greco-Roman, that is to say Greece, is the paradigm by which biblical interpretation has evolved. But there's a real problem here. The real problem is that the Bible was not conceptualized from a Roman or Greek standpoint. It was conceived and built on an African foundation. The goal of the bar is to find and return that foundation to the Bible so that we can have an African context for interpretation. Placing Africa at the center of biblical studies is the ultimate goal of the bar. And there are some very specific reasons for this. Egypt is the longest lasting civilization to ever be on our planet. Next to Israel herself, Egypt is mentioned more times in the Bible than any other people. Egypt is actually mentioned more times than Canaan. It's mentioned more times than Greece or Rome. Egypt is mentioned the most. There are 12,734 Egyptian words in the Old Testament. 256 of those words are identical and taken specifically from the Egyptian. Structurally, the Law of Moses is specifically in an Egyptian format. The wilderness tabernacle is structured and modeled after the Egyptian temple at Karnak. The Promised Land was controlled by Egypt for most of history until the Exodus. Now, here's the important one. The first Bible writer was Moses. Moses was born, raised, and more importantly, educated in Egypt. And that Egyptian education is a primary ingredient that we really need to examine. So how do I do all of this? Well, because the problem is so vast, because we have been doing it the same way for so long, because there are so many ideas out there about the Bible and what it is, there are all sorts of ideas, erroneous ideas many times, for how the Bible should be understood. So the attempt here now is that I take a transdisciplinary approach to try and attempt a foundation of an African foundation for biblical studies. So I turn to theology, but I also turn to archaeology, Egyptology, African studies, and also formal philosophy. In order to return Africa to the center of biblical studies, we are going to have to take on some very technical aspects. And I will reserve those aspects for later videos, but it's going to become very, very important that we point to some very specific and factual evidence for an African presence in the Bible. I think our first task has to be this. There are still some people who don't believe that the Egyptians are an African people. So much propaganda, so much scholarship has come into our civilization and our society, pointing to the fact that the Egyptians are many things except African. But there is a tremendous amount of evidence to suggest that the Egyptians were indeed an African people. And indeed, the Bible speaks of them as an African people. But the evidence for Egypt being African is necessary in order for us to proceed. The reason for this is because there are certain ideas, many ideas within the Bible that cannot be understood correctly unless you put it into an African context. And that African context is Egypt. So, in order to understand the Bible, you are not going to be able to escape Egypt. So, therefore, when we begin, Egypt is our center for trying to understand the Bible because Moses is the first writer of the Bible and every Bible writer follows in Moses' genre. Therefore, if you want to truly understand the Bible, you got to go through Egypt. Thank you.